The Canadian economy added only 7,400 jobs in April. That low number helped push our unemployment rate to 6.9%. Now, manufacturing took a big hit in Ontario. Let's go to Claire Fan on this, senior economist with RBC. Claire, thanks for joining us today. 31,000 jobs lost in manufacturing. Is it primarily automotive?
Right. That's a good question. I think it's fairly spread between different sort of manufacturing sectors, but I think auto is definitely one of the subsector that could expect to see more damages or job losses in the coming months, just because of how concentrated and targeted, the existing tariffs are, or higher tariffs are in the sector.
So Windsor, Ontario now has an unemployment rate above 10%. Do you anticipate a better situation next month? I know you're saying some of it still has to work through, but the CUSMA carve-out, right, could help them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the CUSMA carve-out were essentially, when it comes to broader sort of tariffs measures are sort of levied on Canada, if you were to look at progression since February, they have been on sort of the de-escalating front. Right now, Canada is actually facing the least amount of tariffs, believe it or not, among all U.S. trade partners. So essentially, that's broadly speaking, especially for the sectors when you think about domestic services outside of manufacturing, outside of the sort of steel and aluminum producing provinces where industries essentially could be more muted. But to your point, certain regions essentially will continue to see more disproportionately harder impact.
Retail and wholesale jobs also dropped, so 27,000 lost there. Do you see any specific reason for that, or is this also just tariff related?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, when you think about some of the things, including, let's say, consumer spending, right, as well as housing activity, they have been quite soft, but these are not traditionally a sector that are trade exposed, so to speak. So that more has to do with just a sentiment hit, as we've seen in some of the sort of the consumer confidence data, for example, that dropped to a historical low in March and since rebounded a little bit in April. So that sort of sentiment hit is really causing a lot of damages earlier on in sort of this trade war in terms of housing market activity. Resale activities cooled pretty substantially, and that continued sort of according to the early regional reports for April. Outside of that, retail sales, as we've been tracking, have been contracting moderately, but surprisingly enough, they've not sort of contracted or declined as much as some of these sentiment data would be suggesting. So I think, there is some amount of possibility that, the hit to sentiment is perhaps overdone. And early data, well, at least according to some of the stuff that we're tracking from our internal car spending data, are suggesting that, the trends really, there's some level of resilience remaining, especially when it comes to consumer spending in Canada.
Okay, so let me ask about wider job losses. I'm wondering if you expect some of this to filter into other sectors beyond manufacturing, for example, as the year goes on.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And that's kind of sort of the more secondary impact, right? Essentially, when you think about some of the sectors that are more impacted very earlier on right now, where we're seeing a hit to manufacturing jobs, a hit to, some of the related transportation sectors as well, essentially. But then, when it comes to the broader domestic demand, which is also kind of contracting, and that's the dangerous part. That is where, this very 2-day, pretty limited in terms of the scope of a trade shock to the Canadian economy could really spread to impact some of the other sectors. Retail spending, as I sort of talked about earlier, they're not looking exactly great. They've not contracted by over 5% or nearly as severe. They've contracted by 0.3% around there for sort of the past month that we've been tracking them, but it's still not optimistic. And that's really where, this trade war could be, or the damage of it could be spread beyond just the sectors like manufacturing that are directly involved or implicated to wider sectors, for example, retail, for example, food and dining, and other services sector as well.
Okay, let me talk to you about the public administration jobs that went up in the latest report. There was hiring, of course, for the election. I'm wondering if you strip that out, are we in much worse shape?
Yeah, absolutely. That's sort of the opening sentence is essentially when I do talk about sort of the labor market report today, is that accounting for some of the job gains that are very temporary, in this case over 70 or 35,000 in this case of related to public administration tied to the federal election, we're actually seeing job losses essentially in April.
All right, Claire Fan, I do have to leave the conversation there. I'm out of time with you. Thanks for your time. Claire is a senior economist with RBC.